My son and his wife pushed me through a glass door. As the glass exploded around me, I lay bleeding on the floor. They insisted it was an accident. Alone in that cold kitchen, a thought took root. Maybe, without a paycheck, I was truly worthless. But they had no idea that I had quietly inherited $21 million. They believed I had nothing. What will they do when they discover I can buy and sell everything they possess with cash? I never imagined I would see my own blood staining the kitchen floor. Not in my son's house. Not at 71 years old. It was a Tuesday. Snow had begun to fall, a soft, steady descent that hushed the world just before something shattered. The tension from Bradley and Juliana had been thick all morning. I tried to make myself smaller, a skill older women often learn when they feel their presence is a burden. Juliana stood at the counter, arms folded, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "You're still holding on to the deed, aren't you?" She didn't have to raise her voice. Her tone cut cleanly through the silence. I looked from her to Bradley. He avoided my gaze, absorbed in his phone as if the conversation was happening to someone else. But it concerned all of us. The house was still in my name, a fact they deeply resented. I knew they were planning something. I'd noticed the whispered conversations, the missing letters, the newly locked drawers, but I had remained silent. I calmly stated I wasn't prepared to sign anything, suggesting we could discuss it later, perhaps after dinner. Juliana didn't wait. She advanced toward me, pointing at the back door. She said I needed some fresh air, that I was getting emotional and should step outside. Her hand closed around my arm, firm but not yet forceful. Then, something in the air shifted. Bradley, silent until now, moved to her side. I recall his hand brushing against mine, a gesture that might have seemed like helping me walk. I remember the rigid set of his jaw. The next thing I knew, I was falling. My back slammed against the glass. A loud, dry crack echoed through the house, and then everything gave way. I landed outside, half on the snow-covered patio and half in a pile of shards. The cold bit into my skin, and the smell of my own blood mingled with the bitter scent of pine. For a moment, I believed I might never get up again. But I did. I always do. From inside, I heard Juliana shouting that it was an accident, that I had lost my balance while they were trying to help. Yet they didn't open the door. They didn't come to check on me, not even Bradley. I got to my feet. My hand was bleeding, my coat was torn, and snow was soaking into my shoes. Despite it all, a profound stillness washed over me. It wasn't shock or pain, but a quiet certainty, as if a dislocated part of my soul had finally snapped back into place. I turned and walked down the driveway without a word. It wasn't the first time they had made me feel unwelcome, but it was the first time I saw their intentions so clearly. They wanted me gone. They had plans for the house. And in their minds, I was no longer the mother who had raised him. I was just an obstacle, a signature, a delay. I didn't go to a hospital. I went to the diner on 4th and Maple, slid into a back booth, and ordered coffee with extra cream. The waitress didn't flinch at the sight of the blood. She simply gave me a napkin and said, "Take your time." And I did. As the snow continued to fall that night, I rented a car and checked into a motel. My hands ached, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. I knew I had to be careful, to move quietly. I wouldn't scream, or beg, or play the victim. I would do what I had always done best: observe, think, and act. They thought I was weak and finished. They had forgotten who built this life, who made sure they were never hungry, who paid their college loans, and who co-signed their mortgage. They forgot, but I hadn't. Please subscribe to my channel. I remained at the motel for 3 nights. It was the kind of place with perpetually cold sheets and a ceiling fan that ticked like a clock running out of time. But it was quiet, and no one bothered me. I needed quiet more than comfort. The morning after the incident, I rose early. My hand was swollen, but I cleaned and re-wrapped the wound. Then I made a list of 4 simple, measurable things I could control. At the very top, I wrote a single word: proof. For decades, I had relied on my instincts, reading people in boardrooms and diffusing conflicts with a calm voice and precise words. But this wasn't business. This was my life, my son, my home. The lines had blurred so gradually that I could no longer distinguish between living with family and living among people waiting for me to leave. I remembered installing a small camera a few months prior, on an afternoon when Juliana had taken the children to her mother's. It was a simple device, a backup, disguised as a ceramic owl on the bookshelf. I had told no one, never thinking I would actually need it. But after what happened at the door, I knew. I called Maya, the friend who had helped me set it up. She was an old colleague from the hospital network who worked in tech security, sharp, discreet, and never one for unnecessary questions. Within hours, she had recovered the footage and sent it to my private cloud drive. I watched it only once. Bradley's hands, Juliana's voice, the angle of the push, the sharp crack of glass, and then the silence. There was no room for doubt. This was not a misunderstanding or hurt feelings. It was assault, and they had tried to cover it with feigned concern, all while eyeing the house I had paid it off 27 years ago. The next day I contacted a lawyer. Her name was Nadine, a woman in her 50s with a voice like gravel and steel. She didn't ask for drama. She asked for documentation. I gave her everything. As she began drafting a case for elder abuse and property coercion, I set my own plans in motion. I quietly visited the bank, withdrawing enough cash to move quickly, but not enough to trigger any alarms. The bulk of my funds remained untouched, secured in municipal bonds, a private real estate trust, and an account linked to a trust fund from an old client. $21 million in total. It had taken years to accumulate, but it was mine. I had never mentioned it to Bradley. He assumed I lived off a modest pension, Social Security, and what was left of his father's savings. That assumption fueled his entitlement. Juliana never imagined I could be more than what she saw. A quiet woman in soft sweaters easily dismissed. But I had been building something they never bothered to see. I rented a short-term apartment in town under a different name, a simple, no-frills lease. I didn't need a view. I needed space to think. The first thing I placed on the counter was a folder containing the footage, a copy of the house deed, my living will, and Nadine's initial draft of the complaint. Then I sat down, took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, allowed myself to feel everything. The betrayal, the humiliation, and the deep ache of being seen as disposable by the person I had given everything to. But beneath that ache, something else was blooming, a quiet resolve, not to punish or destroy, but to reclaim. Not just my name on a piece of paper or my house, but my space, my dignity, and my place in the world. And I knew this was just the beginning. I woke before sunrise, not from restlessness, but from a newfound clarity. The quiet hum of the heater and the faint sound of traffic provided a strange comfort in my new apartment. I put water on for tea and stood before the black folder on the counter. Inside, it held 3 documents that carried immense weight. The first was the house deed, my name still clearly on it, with no joint ownership or transfer signatures. I had resisted signing it over for years, guided by a gut feeling that told me to wait. That feeling had saved me. The second was a ledger of my financial holdings, not for pride, but for proof. The money had grown over decades from quiet investments in long-term care facilities, hospital systems, and wellness centers. Former clients had left me portions of their estates in wills and trusts as tokens of gratitude. I never spent much because I never needed to. The third document was a still frame from the security footage printed on the cover page, my face, my hands raised, the instant before I fell. I closed the folder. Today, I would begin the formal process with Nadine, but first, I needed to look back one last time. I pulled a worn green cloth notebook from my purse. Over the years, I had jotted down conversations, dates, and small observations. It wasn't the major events that painted the full picture, but the minor ones. The mail being sorted before it reached me, Bradley's insistence on managing the utility bills, Juliana's casual but calculated questions about my will. Then there were the documents that vanished, my Social Security statements, envelopes from the bank. I remembered asking if my Medicare card had arrived, and Juliana waving it off, saying she'd put it somewhere safe. I never saw it again. Alone in that quiet apartment, I understood that what I had felt wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were preparing for me to disappear without a fuss. I took a long sip of tea and watched the fine, steady snow begin to fall again, blanketing the rooftops like dust on forgotten furniture. After breakfast, I dressed with purpose in gray trousers, a black turtleneck, and a wool coat, the same one I wore when I signed my first leadership contract in 1984. That coat had seen more boardrooms than most junior partners. I walked into Nadine's office at exactly 10 a.m. Her assistant led me into a room lined with legal binders. Nadine sat at a clean desk, with only a pen and a legal pad. She skipped the small talk. She opened the folder, reviewed each page, and nodded. In less than 30 minutes, she confirmed what I already knew. I had a strong case for assault, financial manipulation, coercion, and willful neglect. Colorado's elder abuse laws were clear, and Nadine knew how to navigate them quietly but firmly. I asked her to keep everything sealed for now. I wasn't seeking headlines. I wanted a resolution. She agreed. We would proceed slowly but deliberately. By noon, I had signed the preliminary affidavit. By 3 p.m., copies of the footage were secured in 2 separate locations. By sundown, I was back in my apartment, the folder now thinner, but its contents far more impactful. It would be weeks before charges were filed, but the process had begun. That night, I didn't sleep much. My body ached, and my hand still trembled slightly, but I no longer felt small or invisible. The people I raised saw me as an obstacle, a liability, a delay. But they didn't know that the funds had been moved to a separate holding company, that the trust had been updated to remove all heirs, and that the house title was now shielded by a revocable trust. Most of all, they didn't know that the woman they tried to erase had already written the next chapter without them. The silence I left behind would only grow louder. 3 days later, Nadine called just after 8 a.m., her voice calm and even. The complaint was officially filed and entered into the court system. She advised me not to expect immediate drama, as these things take time. A soft thank you was all I could manage before hanging up. I stood in my small kitchen, letting the silence fill the space. That afternoon, I drove to a private postal center and mailed a sealed envelope to Bradley and Juliana. It contained a copy of the complaint, a letter from my lawyer requesting the return of all house-related documents, and a notice of restricted contact, effective immediately. I didn't linger. By the time I returned to my apartment, the snow was falling heavily, pressing down on the world and muffling all sound. I sat by the window with my notebook, flipping through old entries that now read like a calculated pattern. Juliana accidentally signing for my medical statements 4 months ago. Bradley offering to update the property tax information online last winter. Their attempt to put me on a new phone plan, which cut off my access to my banking app for 2 weeks. It was all so subtle. I made a new list, not of my losses, but of what I still controlled. The deed, the trust, the footage, the law, and myself. The next morning, Nadine emailed an update. The court had set a preliminary review date. If things proceeded as she expected, the footage would be used as direct evidence, and a temporary restraining order could be issued. I felt a sense of alignment settle within me. That week, I met with Marcus, the estate planner who had helped me with a client's retirement portfolio years ago. He was discreet and reliable, always treating me with the respect I commanded at the hospital. I instructed him to prepare documents to move the bulk of my holdings into a new foundation, a nonprofit trust dedicated to supporting career, retraining, and wellness resources for women over 60, especially those who had given everything to their families, only to be discarded. Marcus didn't flinch. He asked intelligent questions, provided timelines, and advised me on the wisest course of action. I left his office with a binder of drafts and a calendar filled with quiet, deliberate steps. The streets outside were slick with ice. I walked slower than usual, not out of fatigue, but because I could finally afford to. That night, I looked through old photo albums, seeking truth rather than sentiment. I wanted to see the real smiles, the holidays where the warmth wasn't rehearsed. One photo stood out. Bradley at 12, sitting beside me on the hospital lawn, his arm looped around my shoulder. He wasn't cruel then, just a boy with more emotion than he knew how to handle. I held the photo for a long time, not to find excuses, but to understand how we had arrived at this point. A few days later, Juliana's voicemail came through. Her voice was tight and professional. She said they had received my lawyer's letter and were surprised by the accusations, hoping to resolve this privately. No apology, just a desire for control. She was more worried about the paper trail than the glass that had pierced my skin. I didn't reply. Nadine would handle all communication. Instead, I prepared. I made copies of every document, storing them in 3 separate locations. I scheduled a follow-up with Marcus to finalize the first transfer of funds. I bought a new, heavy wool coat, built for cold days. The old one, stained with blood, I folded and placed in a sealed bag, a reminder of the line between before and after. Then I went for a walk. The wind was sharp, but my mind was clearer than ever. They thought pushing me through glass would break me. They didn't realize that some glass breaks clean, leaving the woman on the other side sharper, not bitter, just precise. The apartment became a quiet sanctuary as the week progressed. Each morning followed the same ritual: tea, documents, then a walk. It kept me sharp, without letting sadness take hold. On the 5th morning, I drove into the mountains, telling no one, not even Nadine. I had made a reservation at a small cabin near Aspen, under a different name, a habit from my hospital administration days. The air was clean, the snow untouched. I wasn't there for leisure. I was there to remember who I was before the noise started. That evening, I soaked in the outdoor pool, the warm water a stark contrast to the cold air. I let myself sink beneath the surface, not to forget, but to empty myself and make room for what was next. The next morning, wrapped in a blanket on the deck, I sipped coffee and reflected on the version of myself who used to make excuses for Bradley's behavior. The woman who would say, "Maybe he's just stressed," or "Maybe I misunderstood." I stopped making excuses the day my back hit the glass. I walked into a quiet bookstore in town, one I had visited years ago. The owner, Ruth, still remembered me. I picked out a few books about women who remade their lives and left without announcing my presence. By the 3rd day, the cabin felt like it was mine, not through ownership but by choice. There is power in reclaiming space. That night, I wrote letters to myself, to the 40-year-old who spent birthdays alone, to the 50-year-old who helped them buy a house, but wasn't invited to the housewarming, to the 60-year-old who quietly paid off their credit card debt. I forgave each of them because they did the best they could. Without them, I wouldn't be here now, strong enough to walk away, smart enough to plan ahead. That night, the wind howled, rattling the windows and reminding me of how fragile walls can be. But the fire stayed lit and the roof held. I felt awake. The next morning I checked out. The drive back was slick, but I didn't rush. With every turn, I thought about what was coming. I knew Nadine would be preparing the next filing, and Juliana would likely respond with a mix of charm and outrage. Bradley would retreat into his usual resentful silence. But I wasn't going back to that house, or that old version of myself. Instead, I drove directly to the building that housed my newly registered foundation. The paperwork had been finalized 2 days earlier. I walked up to the receptionist and smiled when she said the foundation's name aloud. The Montreux Initiative, a place for women over 60 to rebuild, quietly and powerfully, on their own terms. She handed me the welcome packet. I walked into the small office reserved for me and sat down. There was no ceremony, but inside, I felt a real shift. Bradley once called me too sensitive. Now, I took things personally on purpose, not from a place of pain, but from a place of clarity. Sometimes, after the snow settles, you see that the path was never lost, just covered. And now, I was walking it on my own. The first time I saw Juliana again was at a property showcase. My firm was hosting a tour of renovated homes, and one of them, a minimalist ranch, had been funded by a private investment group. Juliana didn't know that the group had recently come under my management. I arrived early, walking through the house like any other guest, listening to her polished sales pitch about imported tile and solar rebates. She looked the same: perfect hair, a firm voice, a gracious tone that never reached her eyes. When she turned and saw me, her expression flickered for a fraction of a second before she composed herself. I didn't give her a chance to acknowledge me. I walked into the master bedroom, the air smelling of cedar and lemon oil. It was all staged. Nothing felt lived in, much like her marriage. Her young, sharp assistant, Chloe, followed me, informing me in an arrogant tone that this was a private showing. I turned and handed her a business card with the investment firm's name and mine listed as strategic partner. Her eyes widened as she read it, and she stammered something about checking with Juliana. "Take your time," I said. "I'll be in the sunroom." 10 minutes later, Juliana appeared, her calm facade barely concealing her panic. I asked if she had reviewed the latest sponsorship ledger. She didn't answer. I already knew she hadn't. The company she worked for had taken a loan from a group of silent backers for that renovation. By assuming management of the fund, I had become her silent partner, not for power, but for positioning. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. She knew this was no coincidence. "Everything leaves a paper trail," I told her quietly. "All things left behind eventually find their way back home." And then I left. I didn't need a confrontation. I just needed to remind her that she had underestimated the wrong woman. That evening, I sat at a small cafe, sipping black tea as the sky turned a deep purple. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. Later, I checked my email. Nadine had forwarded correspondence from the court. The investigation had moved from preliminary review to active motion. There would be depositions and hearings. The evidence, including the footage, the affidavits from 2 neighbors who heard the argument, and the history of Bradley's attempts to consolidate my bills under his name, was now sealed for the case. That same week, the trust paperwork for the Montreux Initiative was finalized. The bank confirmed the first transfer of $5 million had settled. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. What mattered now was that the ground beneath their feet had begun to shift, and I was no longer standing still. I didn't hear from Bradley directly, but his silence was telling. For someone who always had to be in control, his retreat spoke volumes. Juliana, however, couldn't resist. Nadine forwarded an email from her legal team suggesting a resolution outside of court, citing emotional misjudgments. They wanted a deal. Nadine's reply was brief. The process would continue. Later that day, Marcus called, a tightness in his voice. A third-party real estate group had inquired about the ownership of a parcel linked to my trust. Someone was probing for weaknesses. He had already handled it. The restructuring we did months ago had reinforced everything. This wasn't just pushback. It was desperation disguised as strategy. That evening, I reviewed the list of properties Bradley had once asked me to co-sign. I had declined at the time, guided by an instinct that it was wrong. Now I understood that instinct had protected me. The next morning, Nadine sent another update. The court had approved the next step, a pre-motion hearing, which meant the evidence, including the footage, would be released to both sides. It would no longer be a private file. It would become a matter of record. I spent the afternoon at the local arboretum, finding comfort in moving forward while everything else seemed to stand still. I thought about the last Christmas I spent in that house, feeling like a distorted reflection in a silver ornament. I was glad I hadn't known then that it would be the last time, because I might have stayed too long out of guilt. And guilt is no reason to keep bleeding. Later that week, the court issued a formal notice for the hearing in 2 weeks. It would be a quiet affair, a judge, a few attorneys, and documentation. The beginning of the truth being spoken aloud. Meanwhile, I kept moving forward. I met with the Foundation's first round of advisors, women who had been overlooked but were full of ideas. As I listened, I realized that for all the times my voice had been dismissed, I had never truly lost it. I had just been speaking to the wrong people. After the meeting, a woman named Janice told me she had noticed how I listened, not just to reply, but to hold space for someone else's truth. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to me in a long time. That night, I placed the folder containing my entire case into a new fireproof safe. It was no longer just protection. It was preparation. The house Bradley and Juliana had tried to control was no longer theirs to leverage. The bank had frozen their line of credit. Everything was starting to shake beneath them, and they had no idea how still I had become. Stillness, I had learned, is not weakness. It is waiting with intention. And I was done waiting. It began with a call from Nadine on a quiet Thursday. Her tone was different, weighted. The house was now officially under investigation. The footage had been reviewed by a special division for elder abuse. There would be an official site visit. Officers would walk the grounds and see the place where it happened. Juliana had apparently called the court, frantic and caught off guard. I felt no satisfaction, just a quiet certainty, like watching the first crack spread across a frozen pond. Later that day, I received a text from an unfamiliar number tied to Bradley's phone. "Your neighbors are talking. What are you doing to us?" I didn't respond. I forwarded it to Nadine. That evening, I walked past the legal office that had once rejected my case when I came in, with only a bruised wrist and a trembling voice. Now, I had Nadine, a file the size of a novel, and official attention. At home, I reviewed the timeline of my journey, the fall, the silence, the footage, the filings, the showcase, the trust, the hearing, and now, the site visit. None of it happened overnight, but it had built something undeniable. The next morning, Nadine confirmed the officers had visited the house and spoken to the neighbors. Mrs. Kendall, who lived 2 doors down, gave a sworn statement. She had seen me leave that night, coat torn and blood on my sleeve, but had been afraid to get involved. The footage changed that. It was no longer a matter of opinion. It was fact. Nadine said there was talk of formally charging them both, not just with assault, but with endangerment and concealment of evidence. That weekend, I visited the Foundation's office. A new ivory plaque with the name The Montreux Initiative hung on the wall. A young intern greeted me, and I moved through the space, looking at the shelves of books and grant applications from women who had lived quietly for too long. A life can look ordinary on paper, but the decisions that shape it are often quiet and uncelebrated. Like sitting in a courtroom not as the accused, but as the witness. Like knowing you didn't raise your voice, but you raised the truth. On the drive home, Nadine called again. Juliana's attorney had filed a request for early mediation, a last-ditch effort to avoid formal charges. They knew what was coming, and they were afraid. I pulled the car over and let the cold air sting my face. I didn't feel victorious. I felt awake, alive, and unbroken. The courtroom was cold, its windows facing a row of bare trees. I arrived early, wearing navy slacks and my late husband's watch, not for comfort, but as a reminder of the years I spent holding things together. Today was about ownership. Nadine was already there, her calm presence a steadying force. Across the aisle, Bradley sat stiffly in an ill-fitting suit. He glanced at me once, then quickly looked away. Juliana entered minutes later, dressed in black, and sat in the row behind him, alone. The judge, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair, began by having the clerk read the charges. Misdemeanor elder abuse, obstruction of reporting, and attempted coercion of property. I didn't look at Bradley. Then, Nadine presented the footage on a large monitor. No sound, just the video. My body staggering back, the glass shattering, my disappearance from view die. Silence. The courtroom was still. Even the judge paused before writing something down. Nadine spoke only of facts. My injury, the delay in reporting, the intimidation attempts, the documented pattern of Bradley's financial maneuvers. His attorney responded with deflections, stress, miscommunication, a family argument taken out of context. Juliana was asked if she wanted to make a statement. She shook her head. Her silence was the loudest thing she had ever said. The judge didn't deliberate long. She ruled that the case would proceed to a full review. The protective order would be extended, and their financial access would be frozen pending an audit. When the gavel fell, I simply stood, nodded to Nadine, and walked out without looking back. At a nearby cafe, I opened my notebook, drew a line through the date, and wrote one sentence. I am not broken. When I got home, a handwritten letter from Bradley was waiting. He was sorry. He was under pressure. He didn't know what came over him. He asked me to remember the boy he used to be. I read it once, folded it, and put it in a drawer. Forgiveness is a process, not a performance. That night, I sat by the window in the dark. The house they tried to take was restored to my name, the will was updated, and my foundation had gained its nonprofit status. I had found a new kind of power, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that builds. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, Bradley's letter still tucked away. I had given too much, raised a son on fear, not of punishment, but of disappointment. I had enabled a man who learned that apologies were enough, and forgiveness was automatic. I stood and walked to the window. Tightness in my chest was finally gone. The next morning, I attended a community roundtable hosted by the foundation. Dozens of women shared their stories, their voices growing stronger in a room filled with understanding. A woman named Felicia sat beside me. I used to think becoming invisible was just part of aging, she said. I admitted I had once mistaken silence for strength. She laughed softly. Then maybe it's time we rewrite what strength looks like. That evening, Marcus called. The final audits were in. Every attempt they had made to touch my assets had failed. A law student working with him wanted to use my case as a precedent to raise awareness about systemic elder abuse. I gave my consent, not for my story to be told, but for others like me to know they weren't alone. That week, Juliana's name was removed from 2 properties she had tried to leverage, and the judge set a hearing for Bradley's financial restitution. I felt no triumph, just a quiet clearing of the path before me. That weekend, I returned to Aspen, walking the trails not as someone escaping, but as someone returning. I stopped at a ridge overlooking the valley, closed my eyes, and whispered to myself, "You didn't deserve any of it, and you survived it anyway." That night, I slept through the night for the first time in years. It was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming my voice. I walked into the foundation office on a snowy Monday morning. The walls were now covered with photos of the women we had helped. I felt a sense of belonging, of being just another person doing the work. In the conference room, I removed a sealed packet from a drawer. It contained the final paperwork transferring my remaining assets, $21 million, into the trust fund. I wanted the money to outlive me in a way that carried no blood or guilt. I signed the last page, a quiet goodbye to the person I used to be. That evening, I drove to my old house one last time. The new owners, a retired couple, were home. The porch light was on, and wind chimes swayed in the breeze. The new glass door still had a faint mark where the original had splintered. I didn't need to get out. I'd already reclaimed it in a different way. As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Nadine. The final judgment was in. Bradley was ordered into counseling and placed under a restricted financial order for 5 years. Juliana had settled, relinquishing all claims. It was over, not with headlines, but with signatures and silence. I drove back to my apartment and sat in the car, letting the weight of it all settle. There had been no screaming matches, just quiet consequences. The father of my grandson, the boy I once nursed through the flu, the man who forgot I was human. He would carry his own burdens. I would carry peace, clarity, and purpose. At our next staff meeting, an intern asked how we decide who to support. "We look for women who remind us of who we used to be," I told her. "Not to save them, but to stand beside them while they learn to save themselves." Please subscribe to my channel.